Greetings to all participants of networking event of the Health Chapter organized within the annual Congress of the World Association of PPP Units and PPP Professionals. I'm Natalia Korchakova-Hip, Global Lead for Public-Private Partnerships and Siemens Healthineers, and also Head of Health Chapter. And my task today will be to moderate the session. Before we start, some housekeeping information. The webinar is being recorded and is scheduled to finish in about 45 minutes, but we could extend this time to allow some more questions and answers. Every speaker will have about 5 minutes. You could ask questions to speakers. Please, for this purpose, use question and answers section on your right, not the chat. Another possibility is to raise a hand, and then we will invite you to the stage, and then you will be able to ask your question yourself. So we are very fortunate today to have a very distinguished panel. Very well-known experts in the industry, representing key stakeholders, international organizations, national governments, investors, and private companies, coming from different countries and working in various geographies. So we will hear today about projects in Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Let me briefly introduce speakers in the order of speaking. And I will start with Marcus Martinez, who is the Associate Director leading the PPP Project Preparation Unit in EBRD. He has more than 15 years of experience in PPP projects, including healthcare. The team led by Marcus focuses on bankability of PPP projects and project finance. Thanks, Marcus, for being with us today. Next speaker is Renas Rehit, who is the Senior Vice President at Siemens Healthineers and the Global Head of Sales for Enterprise Service Business. Renas is leading global operations on value partnerships and has an extensive experience in implementation of healthcare PPPs in various parts of the world. Very warm welcome, Renas. Next speaker is Dr. Mohamed Al-Aghili, who is the Senior Advisor at the National Center for Privatization and PPPs in Saudi Arabia. He held an advisor role to the Deputy Minister of Public Health, in which he initiated projects on national health accounts, health technology assessment, and primary healthcare privatization. When Vision 2030 was announced, Dr. Al-Aghili joined the core team dedicated to the Ministry of Health transformation. Welcome, dear Mohammed. And then we have a next speaker, Dr. H.M. Gore, Executive Director, Tile Partners, and he has more than 20 years of international experience. Tile Partners is a Singapore-based equity fund which has invested in a number of PPP healthcare projects in Asia. Dr. Gore has a profound expertise in hospital management, private equity, venture capital investment in Asia. Welcome, Dr. Gore.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Julien Beaujolin, who is the CEO and founder of ACMP, a healthcare operating firm providing solutions to bridge the healthcare infrastructure gap in Southeast Asia. He works in partnership with public and private hospitals to deliver cardiac cath labs and diagnostic imaging services in Indonesia. Welcome, Julian.
Thank you.
And last but not least is Elian Muratai, Senior PPP expert from PPP Health for All. Elian is a seasoned PPP professional with more than 10 years of experience working in PPP unit of Albania and Ministry of Finance. He is specializing on PPP project monitoring, KPIs, and market sounding. Thanks, Elian, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, sustainable infrastructure and public-private partnerships are essential foundations for achieving sustainable development goals, and especially Sustainable Development Goal number 3, health and well-being. In the context of global pandemic, tightening public budgets, and growing demand for healthcare services, PPPs provide an opportunity for innovative and collaborative service delivery. The purpose of this session is to discuss best practices in doing next generation PPPs. And my first question goes to Marcos Martinez. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development supports projects in nearly 40 countries. And as we know, is committed to the principles of sustainable infrastructure. How this approach is operationalized during preparation of current healthcare PPP projects, for instance, in Kazakhstan?
Thank you, Natalia, and thank you for inviting me and speaking on behalf of EBRD. Sustainable infrastructure is all about developing infrastructure in a way that doesn't jeopardize the economy, the ecology, and the societies where we operate. I mean, to keep it simple, is all about following the SDGs, which is kind of this international language where all IFIs, MTBs, multilaterals speak, including donors. But in terms of your question on how we specifically address this, it depends on project by project. So when we work on, we're working a project in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, for a hospital. We're also working on hospitals somewhere else in Romania and Greece, for example. And it's very custom based. So it depends on the project, and it's a question you need to make yourself, okay, while you prepare the project. These questions can be around the level of involvement of the community. Has there been has the community been asked? Have there been stakeholder engagement? And is the community one of the stakeholders to be considered? Does the project include solutions that take into account low-income groups? That includes in the value chains of the project, right? One of the main critics of PPPs is that they are fit for bigger corporations and bigger groups, and they leave aside smaller local entrepreneurs and small, medium companies, local companies. However, when we structure projects, we keep in mind that we need to include requirements in the procurement. So these big players that are actually required to make the project bankable, they have the obligation to subcontract local, to contract locally in order for the project to bring wealth also local. Another questions we ask in this sense is energy. Okay, energy is critical, and developing projects that are energy efficient and ideally even net zero in the way they produce electricity and the way they produce energy, and the way they are structured is critical. But again, that's very custom based. For example, in the case of Romania, we are working a project in Brussels. We just realized that to make the project net zero, we need to include a mandatory requirement for bidders to produce heat with heat pumps, but they need to be underground heat pumps. Okay, so again, that's going to be a requirement that we include, and it's part of the due diligence. Okay, and that's what is also very important, that governments and countries, when they structure these projects, have professional and experienced advisors, because if not, they are going to miss all of this. Okay, and it's very critical nowadays that when we plan, design, and structure projects that are going to have an impact in decades and generations, we do it in a sustainable way. So it's very critical that we include all these questions that, I'm sorry, but they are very custom-based. They depend on the project. And those questions we are answering in Romania, they don't have the same answer in Almaty, in Kazakhstan. So that's the way we do it. It's very I guess in summary, is bringing very good advisors, experienced advisors, and going through how we can make the project more sustainable in terms of energy, in terms of community, and more local. Okay, I'll leave it here. Natalia?
Thank you, Marcus. And but if we look from investor perspective, how are you going to attract investors, and what are the main KPIs for, let's say, again, Almaty project to ensure its long-term success?
I mean, bringing investors into structured projects in countries like Kazakhstan, which is investment grade, so it's almost investment grade, it's not really that difficult if you have a bankable structure. So what we do is we start the dialogue very early. When we have the structure agreed with the public sector, with the client, we test that structure that we believe is bankable, but we test it with the market. We run a roadshow for the project, market sounding exercises where we bring investors, we present the project at a high level, and we ask questions about issues, risk allocations that we are not that certain they are going to be accepted for investors that go in for first time to a pilot project like one in Kazakhstan. And then obviously we need to incorporate the feedback. Okay, you receive a lot of feedback, and you need to screen out based on your experience, based on good practice, in order to come up with a project that is robust. It defends also the interest of the public client, of this case of the Ministry of Health and the Republic of Kazakhstan, in terms of it needs to be affordable. It has to be, it should not be a huge fiscal constraint into the public budget for the country for generations. But again, obviously, if you ask the market, they will ask for, they have a very long wishing list, but you also need to screen that out. Okay, but again, good projects, bankable projects in countries that have good policy and good framework, they will attract good investors.
Thank you, Marcus. And next question would go to Renas. Renas, Siemens Healthineers is known for having a strong pipeline of PPP projects and value partnerships, which offer transformational value to the partners. Could you please mention some example of PPPs and where Siemens is engaged, and also elaborate how exactly value partnerships bring transformations?
Thank you for that question, Natalia. And I want to use the phrase Marcus just said, it's decades of impact. And that's really what we see. I mean, we have been engaging in PPP projects for many years. The larger engagements actually started in the UK. Since 1999, we have been contracting there for what is called a managed equipment service. And we see there contracts where we are a subcontractor to a special purpose company, like in Bart's Health NHS Trust or in the University Hospital of North Midlands. But also these decades of impact, our longest contract is actually 40 years with the Dudley Group NHS Foundation Trust, where we constantly make sure that the equipment is up to date for that trust. But we also have experience with direct contract with the government in a PPP scheme, like in Murcia in Spain, where we have been responsible for the full medtech set, 18,000 line items to be delivered as part of that relationship. And it goes beyond that. In Turkey, for example, where we also are part of the technological operations of a lab department in the country as part of the PPP projects, for example, Ankara City Hospital. That's history. These were called managed equipment services in the past. Now we are calling them value partnerships. Why did we rebrand, actually? And if you look at the opportunities out there in the market, like in Japan, in Saudi Arabia, in Kazakhstan, in Latin America, in ASEAN, so many opportunities out there. And the key topic of all these projects is how do you drive transformation over that long-term period? How do you drive the success? How do you keep constant innovation ongoing? So we are suggesting to change the role from an equipment supplier who can encompass many equipment and also take care about that uptime service of that equipment, but to add on top actually the transformational approach to say KPI-driven dashboards visualizing how are operational workflows going on, and then also bring consultants in order to see how that can be improved. Those transformational value partnership could include a long-term education plan for that project as staff is changing over time, the generations, as Marcus just said, are coming in and going out. And finally, potentially also have part of that activities in the PPP project run by us. So bring in experts who would take a part of the activities in order to ensure deliverables. That's what we today call a value partnership.
Well, thank you, Renes. But talking about transformation and positive impact, what is the sustainability strategy of Siemens Healthineers, and what are the key parameters, so-called materialities, for PPP projects?
Right. As Siemens Healthineers, we're also committed to the United Nations sustainability targets. And actually, we are focusing on the target number 3, the good health and well-being, the target number 5, gender equality, and number 12, the responsible consumption and production. So how do we do that? Let's take good health and well-being. It's really about getting access to healthcare, specifically in developing countries. And we have looked at a number, and I'm reading that here. We used to have 220 million patient touchpoints in these countries. A touchpoint would be someone using our equipment, for example, in these countries. And we want to grow that strongly until fiscal year 30 to really have more presence and more access to healthcare in these countries. But also innovations can drive access to care by using artificial intelligence, which is then reducing the load on the experts because simple cases could be supported in, for example, diagnostics procedure when you read a lung CT where we have a procedure available. And if we look at the target number 12, the sustainable handling of resources, the circular economy, our ecoline, for example, but also our target to massively reduce the carbon CO2 emissions over the next years. And today, I think we're around 130 kiloton. That will go massively down. And that's our commitment also to that program.
Thank you, Renes. This is excellent examples. And now we move to the next speaker, Mohammed Al-Aghili. Mohammed, Saudi Arabia is going through very significant transformations right now, right, in the provision of healthcare services, shifting from the budget-based financing to a so-called system of accountable care. The question for you, what innovative measures the country needs to adopt to ensure that PPP projects would help in achieving this new paradigm, and also what structures you have in place to support the financing of healthcare PPPs and infrastructure projects in general?
Thank you, Natalia. It's an excellent question. Well, as you know, when it comes to healthcare, it's a very essential social infrastructure that is needed, and you cannot stop the development of healthcare in order to do the transformation. Therefore, we go to the example of healthcare is like a flying plane in which that you need to fix it while it's flying. Therefore, some measures have been taken by the government in order to ensure that the PPPs in the health sector will address the changes that are expected in the transformational change into an accountable care organization. Example for that is what was mentioned by our colleagues, taking into consideration programs that showed efficiency, like the role of artificial intelligence in diagnostic and virtual medicine, and the ability of looking into having PPP project in this kind of field. Also, we're looking into services like case management and other operational services within, also with the development of the infrastructure in which that will add value and will fast track the vision in transforming the healthcare sector. This will need a lot of effort, and therefore major tools have been developed, KPIs to look into adapting these new risks that will be part of the new PPP structure that of the deals that will be released to the market. And in order to meet all of that, we are engaging actively with the market in early stages, especially the private investors, to get their feed in specific projects that are, I can say, that are unorthodox projects. Maybe there is minimum example of them around the world, just to get their feed and understand their risk. When it comes to the financial aspects, so the government is investing a lot in developing entities and institutes in which they can act as a complementary financing agency for PPP deals. In the case that the private market financing is for specific deal is, as example, we couldn't achieve financial closure, or there are some sort of risk that the private consortium would consider such an entity similar to IFIs. One of which is the development of the National Infrastructure Fund, which is a new entity that will be playing a major role in looking into PPP deals and identify their potential of granting a chunk of the finance of these deals through that institute.
Thank you, Mohammed. And given the recent announcement of His Excellency Minister of Finance in relation to the portfolio of privatization and PPP projects of $55 billion over the 5 next year, what percentage of healthcare projects would you anticipate? And maybe you could give us just update about current pipeline of PPP projects in your country.
Well, as been announced, we are looking into a major paradigm shift here when it comes to the financing of infrastructure deal and raising finance through PPPs. And for us, we are hoping that the cut for the healthcare sector will be in billions, within a minimum of $5 to $8 billion. We're targeting these numbers, not only for PPPs. We're looking at opportunities of possible JVs in which that the private sector together with the government sector can develop some of the government service into a corporatized service. And currently we're working in the new strategy for privatizations and PPP for the health sector. Hopefully it will be announced within a month or two. That will look into several opportunities and several new structure of deals. Going back to the second part of your question, which is related to today we have an active pipeline. We have 2 deals. One of them is currently in the market in the RFP stage. We're expecting to receive the proposals for it within the next couple of months, which is related to a development of a new greenfield hospital in the city of Medina. And the other one, we finished the RFQ stage, and we are in the process of releasing the RFP, finalizing the RFP and releasing it within the next month or so. For further detail, you can go to the investor portal in the National Center of Privatization website. You will find a very interactive page there, which is the investor portal. You will see all the active deals, not only in the healthcare, education, and other sectors, with a clear timeline and the phase for each one of these deals. We have also another mental health related projects and specialized hospital are in the pipeline.
Well, thanks a lot. It's very impressive pipeline, and we're wishing you a lot of success with your project. And now let's move to investors. So, Dr. Go, you speak on behalf of investors today, and maybe you could elaborate what healthcare PPP project you have invested, and what were your decision-making metrics, the key points that you decide upon when investing in PPP project, and what are the lessons learned?
Okay. All right. Good morning. It's an interesting question. I think because as a clinician, I used to be on the investee clinical user standpoint. So what I observe that there is a significant shift in terms of how PPP projects are structured and invested. With regards to the decision-making matrix, I think if we want to close the deal from today onwards, I think, of course, the pandemic perspective is very important now, because most of the business model is expected to transform post-COVID. And we are increasingly, I think most of the private equity fraternities are increasingly looking at projects that has the potential to catalyze and galvanize some form of ecosystem transformation. We have moved away from looking specifically on projects, very bottom line centric. I think it does, it helps when the whole social impact investments philosophies has actually permeated into the investment fraternity. ESG, for example, has also changed how we look at the return on investments, and not purely from the standpoint of financial returns. That is a very big change, because when I was clinical users involved in PPP project in Malaysia, in the university system, we were always under a lot of pressure from the investor to deliver financial bottom line results. And that is very frustrating. So now crossing to a different side of the table, because now I'm with the private equity, so I can start to understand and empathize the challenges. And it was actually a relief that we realized that the investment criteria is no longer very financial centric.
Okay.
Because of all these changes. Yeah. So of course, the changes will still take time. I think there are still a lot of projects. Majority of the criteria are still financial. Private equity are limited by the mandate. We still have a very limited short runway, which is sometimes it's mismatched with the healthcare investments that has a rather long runway from the investment horizon standpoint. Yeah.
And do you pursue the impact investing for all healthcare PPP projects, or are you doing this selectively?
I think increasingly institutional investors will be viewed very positively if you have more ESG criteria are satisfied in your reporting, right? So ESG reporting is increasingly very important for us, and we are looking at projects that has ecosystem based. Usually, it will take a long time to actually get the return on investments. So then the emphasis has to be more towards trying to find a way to measure the social impact to justify for why we are putting money into these projects. Yeah.
But I know that you actually invested in very big PPP project in Vietnam. Maybe you could talk specifically about this case, lessons learned, what did wrong, or what you would do differently from your experience.
Yeah. Vietnam is a very interesting market. It's like a darling of Southeast Asia right now. The geography, whenever we put in projects pitch to investment committee, you say Vietnam, you are halfway through the door, right? To convince the investment committee, because they are a very strong growth, large market of almost 100 million people, very underserved. So we have invested in a very large PPP project. It's probably the largest hospital PPP that has 2,000 beds right now, and it's going to be 3,500 beds when it's fully expanded. There's almost 12% of the private market share. And of course, like any emerging countries and countries like Vietnam, China, the whole investment considerations we really need to think of is also political will and political capital. Because healthcare is a highly regulated industry, especially in countries like Vietnam. If you have a good business case, you still need to make sure that the political buy-in is attained. Failing that, it's almost impossible to actually get into those markets. So, I mean, there's a few lessons learned, right? So of course, in the PPP, in our project, we are basically providing capital to build a private wing co-located in the same campus of a large public hospital that is run out of capacity. So, and the private funds will, the PE funds will take on a controlling interest on that environment. And part of the manpower will be seconded from the public systems. So that is actually a good way to start, because we've got economy of scale, we have ready manpower resources. However, the biggest challenge will be the mindset change. We always say that raising capital is easy. Raising a human capital is the extremely difficult endeavor, because the mindset change of how the provider, the doctors, will be able to deliver private healthcare. Of good public healthcare clinicians might not necessarily are familiar with what the private patients, fee-paying patients' expectations. And there are accounting standards differences in the public systems, and there are taxations, knowledge that we have to educate our partners in the public sector, as well as the way how we discharge fiduciary duty, where we have to fulfill the public policy as well as the corporate governance expectations in the private sector. And that is actually quite a challenge for us, especially as we are sitting in a board. We have to fulfill, make sure government procedures are met, administratively is okay, and then regulation-wise from the Company Act, enterprise regulations are fulfilled. Right. So that's the challenge.
Thank you. Thank you so much, because it's always interesting to hear about real examples and real projects, like, for instance, Ren has mentioned. It was, thank you very much. And let me move to the next speaker, Julian. Julian, you're also doing quite a lot of PPP projects in Indonesia. So maybe you could elaborate what kind of services you are doing related to healthcare PPPs, and what problems face, lessons learned. We don't hear you. Turn on microphone, please.
Sorry. Hi, Natalia. Thank you. Thank you all. So we provide basically clinical support services where we focus mainly on the, I would say, capital intensive and know-how intensive subspecialties such as cardiac care, cath labs, diagnostic imagings, and hopefully soon oncology care. So we mainly do that in partnership with public and all private hospitals. So we've done about 19 projects across Indonesia. 13 of those are cardiac care projects, and 6 of those are diagnostic imaging centers. To give you a picture, 80% are in public hospitals, and the other one are private partnerships. So the challenge is that first, this rapid growth over 4 years, some centers didn't have enough clinical capacity to fulfill the schedule. So it was the first challenge. In Indonesia, moving doctors between hospitals, moving doctors between provinces is complicated. Paperwork, of course, is complicated. Different medical associations are fighting between each others. So moving a cardiologist from Jakarta to Medan can be a challenge. So that's the first. Obviously, no doctor, meaning you can't push patients through the door, excuse my terms. And the second is, I think we've we've suffered from the learning curve of universal healthcare. Indonesia, to give you some context, has implemented universal healthcare as we know it about 8 years ago. In 8 years, 220 million people got covered. So obviously a massive challenge due to the learning curve from the operator's point of view and from BPJS, the Social Security's point of view. And on top of that, 2019 was a political year, election year. So BPJS was heavily politicized. And due to that politicization, I would say they've slowed down their expansion of coverage to limit deficit, naturally. So this has impacted us quite a lot in terms of, ready to be reimbursed centers. So that was really the main thing. Would we have gone slower? Would we have had the same problems? Difficult to say, but that's the problems we faced. And I think you've asked what is missing in the environment. So the PPP healthcare PPP landscape in Indonesia is relatively new. Some PPP hospital projects are ongoing and relatively new. I mean, it's a couple of years old. Obviously, last year was obviously a total dead zone for those projects. In my view, what is missing is the regulation from the government to ensure a leveled playing field. Which means they need capacity to track and assess the quality of each contracts, which is today clearly not very well done. Assess the clinical quality and the outcome for the patient. This obviously has the impact that you have obviously bad apples, I would say, as competitors. And second, maybe the most important for us is Indonesia is extremely closed in allowing importing foreign healthcare talent. Due to the healthcare laws and human resource laws. So that's obviously a major problem because you can't, even a cardiologist, an Indonesian cardiologist who is living in the US, perfectly trained, is not allowed to come back home and exercise his profession. And that has a massive impact obviously on training of future cardiologists in our case. And that would, and I think Vietnam did that a while back already, where they allowed foreign clinicians, Vietnamese origin, to come back and or foreigners as well. And that could alleviate the massive training gap there is in the clinical space. And last but not least, of course, financing, as always. The financing locally is in healthcare, relatively difficult to come by. Very few groups understand the technical aspect and the long-term aspect of those projects. And foreign capital isn't easy as well because it's complex projects. So few investors understand those type of projects. We personally, as a group, we think about even going public because we do believe that it could help increase transparency, increase access to a wider and deeper pool of capital, and that could hopefully maybe be the answer to attract in Indonesia and maybe across the region more capital in that field.
Julian, you already answered this question, but maybe I could reiterate because you could compare Indonesia to some other countries. And do you see any specifics particular to Indonesia market related to PPP healthcare?
Well, I think the first is that clearly there's very low trust between public and private. Obviously, when we arrive in a public hospital, either the management is on board, the end users are on board, and even though you always have convincing naturally to do, or they're totally closed, but in general there's low trust, so that's obviously a problem. I would say, to come back to the financial aspect, this low trust is also related to the fact that our equipments are always related to, or usually related to, kickbacks sometimes because it's high ticket items. Which obviously is a source of funding for some of people and groups. So that's something we have to fight against, clearly. So that we do believe, of course, in the medium terms, our model and what everyone around this table is trying to do is helping also that aspect, because it's a very big issue. And the second, I think, more on the cultural front, more in Indonesia, I think things are progressing slowly. It's just the way it is. I think it's partly cultural. It's also partly bureaucratic between the size of the country, the national and regional governments. So I think you have to have a lot of patience.
Well, thank you, Julian, for your very honest questions. I think, it's, I wish we receive such a feedback on each country, because it's a lot of learning and a lot of room for improvement, and this is why we're here to see how we could create an enabling environment for healthcare PPPs in every country. And moving now to you, Arian. We've heard that already. Marcus and some other speakers, Mohammed, I think, mentioned the importance of early market sounding. And you worked for more than 10 years in the PPP unit of Albania, and now also doing a lot of market sounding for the clients. Why, in your opinion, market sounding is so important?
Yes, thank you, Natalia. It's really an honor to be in distinguished guest panelist, and it's very professional and high-level senior experience. And for returning to your question, is like why market sounding is important. First of all, it's like market sounding normally takes place in the early stages of the PPP projects, and before the tender is launched, to check with potential bidders and stakeholders for the purpose of the parameters of the project. And the purpose of market sounding is to make sure that the project is feasible, it's bankable, and the companies would be interested to bid. And here is when many of the problems and also a lot of the success is being filled when the market sounding is used in both ways. Ideally, a list of specific issues on which the public authority is seeking assistance feedback from the market should be provided to the market participants. It is important to be transparent without and about what is known from the market, transparent about what is known and is not known about the project, and receive an informed feedback from the market. It's really important that all the parties should be treated fair and transparent to sound a very good practice about the market sounding. It is also important for the future bidders to be assured that the solution is not being developed switched on particular bidder on the project. And this was this is on one of the, let's say, cons about the market sounding, and that's why I'm telling that it really need to be very, very clarified that the market sounding should be treated fair and transparent throughout the process. As you all might know, I'm representing the PPP for All, that is a global platform to facilitate healthcare PPPs. And we see a lot of developments around the world to have a very significant need for market sounding in the projects. Unfortunately, there are many cases where the market sounding was not done at all, or was done in non-transparent and fragmented manner. A lot of potential problematic issues could be cleared at this stage. And for closing, it's like every project needs to have the right bidder and the right, let's say, beneficiary. And to provide this is the tool of market sounding is very important for the market and for the lifestyle of the project. Sorry.
Well, I could only confirm that market sounding is an important exercise, which instrumental for all parties involved, and of course, all the process has to be documented and made transparent to make sure, as you rightly said, that no one benefit from this, and it's not done in the favor of certain parties. So this is the questions which I wanted to ask as a moderator, and now I would like to give opportunity to speakers to ask questions if they are interested, because I'm sure there might be some interesting questions, and then we open the floor for discussion with our audiences, because we receive a number of questions already.
Dr. Mohammed, I have one. Obviously, an interested one. What would be your view for Saudi Arabia to, for a player, I mean, like us, or there's others, I guess, but if you had to, I mean, the public sector, I imagine, is very big in Saudi Arabia, and to carve out cardiac, oncology, imaging out of the public sector, could that be something of interest?
Good question. So we never close the door when it comes to discussing new opportunities. And to be honest with you, there are some opportunities when it comes to cardiac, for example, centers and knee replacement centers and so on. So yes, we're looking at several stages. For example, now we're focusing in the very high priority projects in which that will aid on the shift towards accountable care system. And in the meanwhile, we're discussing other opportunities that the private sector would be interested to take the demand risk in. So one of the major aspects of PPP, as you know, is who's gonna be in charge of the demand risk. I'm not talking about infrastructure PPPs, I'm talking mainly in the operation or the combined kind of PPPs. So if you have the interest to come and offer us something and take the demand risk, then it's a very useful topic for us to discuss, actually.
Okay. Thank you.
I would have a question to Dr. Go. You said there are criteria for investors which go beyond financials. What are those, for examples?
I think the most non-financial criteria are predominantly on human capital development. I think that is the most important points, which, because of PPP, the public sector's stakeholders, they like the fact that if foreign direct investments that comes to a country, it must actually develop the local talents so that the project is more sustainable. Because if not, they will always have this fear that if the foreign parties comes onto the country, we will invest, we make the money, and then we will take the money away at the end of our investments and get our returns. So we will be looking at the full-time equivalent of certain specialty, certain skill sets that will be defined in the projects. And the other thing is provide the avenue for local clinicians to be trained in other countries. Being a Singapore-based private equity, we have this opportunity to bring our investee to Singapore, let them second them to some tertiary hospitals, let them have the right exposure to actually visualize what kind of reform agenda that we have. Because sometimes we say, okay, these particular procedures, the average length of stay is 3 days, not 6 days, but they don't believe us, right? So we have to bring them to a different environment and see for yourself. It can be done with half of the average length of stay, and that itself will bring down a lot of costs. So these are the main criteria. Apart from that, we also look at the information management aspects of it. Any investments must trigger more transparencies in terms of from an informatics standpoint, where we can do more analytics, These are extremely valuable outcome for the government. So they will slowly move away from statistical data collected by those statistical agencies. They will start to get data from the clinical frontline. That is extremely important as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If there are no any more questions from speakers, then we open the floor for questions from the audiences. And first question from Levin Jacquemin. Levin, would you like to go to the stage, or shall I read your question?
There we go. Yes, hello, hi, thanks. That was a very interesting discussion, and yeah, I learned a lot here as well. I guess my question was, because Mr. Renas, you were talking about value partnerships. I mean, just to be in all transparency, I was part of your friendly competitors, GE Healthcare, doing similar kind of MES projects. So it's good to know that it kind of moved a little bit beyond MES, so that's good. And so my question was, you call it now value partnerships. Does that go beyond, or how do you measure the success of such a value partnership? I mean, it's good that it's called value, but value for what? Is it money or people or future or what?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, the value is actually the perceived value by the one who is receiving it. But if I would look in total, what the real value we're achieving is, it's mostly for people, be it staff of the hospital or be it patient. Value for money, I would say when you start a PPP, that's the main focus. Do you have the right sizing? Do you have the right technology in place? What's the best price on that? That's the first start of the value for money. And later on, the value for money comes when you have the optimal processes, the optimal throughput in the infrastructure. But that optimal throughput in the infrastructure also gives you the people who are intrigued by such an environment. So you get the best of the best if you have the best of the best infrastructure and processes. So it's somehow linked. And if you look in specific projects, what we do, take an example, a project in the US where we're looking at the stroke workflow. So patient is coming in, emergency department, and then until you start the procedure. So that's one time you would measure clinical quality at the end. You look at the length of stay, but you would also look at the disability payments which the society have to take after the patient is discharged from the hospital. So that's value for future. So somehow it's all in there, but mostly I would say it's for people, because a patient who is treated well, if you have a well-run organization, clinically and operationally, the patient is benefiting the most.
Right. Okay, thank you for that.
Levin, since you are on the stage, maybe I could ask you a question. We have two questions in the chat, and maybe we could invite this person to the stage asking a question personally.
That is, if they like to, that would be great. But in that case, they would need to raise their hand. They would see a raise hand button at the bottom of their screen, and then we can bring them to the stage.
Okay, but I think the question is in the Q&A session is for you, Dr. Goh. Maybe you could read it and answer.
I'm still trying to figure out how to see the question.
Okay, I will do it for you. Vietnam is much ahead in health PPPs. However, there is a gap between the return per bed by the private sector and cost per bed per person by the government. How do you bridge this gap?
I think if you look at the entire Vietnam in terms of the private healthcare participations in the entire healthcare system, private sectors is a very small minority proportion, right? So I think we need to see the private sectors and the public sectors has maybe a 50-50% coverage, means that the 50% of the healthcare resources are provided by private. That will take maybe another 10 years or so. Then those matrix you mentioned will be more accurate to calculate from there. At this point in time, is extremely underserved as far as I'm concerned. I think the focus right now of most projects is all about economy of scale. Because in investments, one of the most difficult challenges are investing into one hospital, spend a lot of money on that capital outlay, and but not achieving economy of scale. Either you are too big, too early in that particular market, and then you have this very painful operation cash flow crunch for a long time. So what we try to avoid that is, that's why when we entered Vietnam, we straight away went into projects that has 2,000 beds, consists of multiple hospitals. Although the financial performance in the beginning might not look wonderful, but that is the only options there are, because we can either enter into a large project with economy of scale from day one, or you go into a single hospital and then operate at a sub-optimal level for a long time, or you acquire a secondary brownfield sites, which is probably converted from shop lots. So in Vietnam, the choices are pretty obvious, right? You have to go big, and that's the only way we can push down all these cost per beds and all these metrics. Yeah. So it's all about scale.
Thank you.
Sorry, Natalia.
Natalia. Yes.
Sorry, I might need to interrupt actually, if you don't mind, because the other sessions already started. So for any further questions, would it be okay to invite the participants to maybe one of the lounge tables and continue any further discussion there? Would that be okay?
Sure. Yeah, we will go as a networking session then, right?
Yes, if you don't mind. The other sessions have already started, and we kind of need to also go there to help them host it. But frankly, I thought it was really very interesting. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Well, okay, then let me do the closing. I will first of all would like to thank all the speakers, because it was an excellent discussion, and amazingly we've done it on time. And yeah, I hope we inspire some thinking how we could do better in terms of integrating SDGs and deliver value for money, but also value for people. I think it was discussed today. Let me close the session, and thank you for your participation. And I would like to invite you to stay and go to the lounge table where we could, informally interact if you are interested for another 15 minutes. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Natalia.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.